Hello, and welcome to week 4 of the course. This week we're going to start talking about formative assessment. And we're going to be beginning to explore the assignment for formative assessment later in the PowerPoint. Let's start with what is formative assessment. Formative assessment involves the gathering of evidence of student learning, providing feedback to students, and adjusting instructional strategies to enhance achievement. Formative assessment most frequently occurs during the lesson or unit. So formative assessment is sometimes used very quickly and on the fly, and sometimes it takes a little time to think about and prepare and plan for. Homework, for example, can be formative assessment. Questioning can be formative assessment. This is different than summative assessment, which usually occurs at the end of a lesson or unit and measures learning. There's been a little confusion, some of you thinking that formative assessments can't be formal, for example. So let's clarify the definition of what formal and informal means. Formal assessments basically are any assessments that are graded. So a quiz, if I grade it, can be a formal assessment. A project can be a formal assessment. Tests and other types of things, anything that's graded is considered a formal assessment. Informal assessments, however, are not usually graded, such as if I'm looking around the room at body language, I'm observing, if I'm questioning students. These things, obviously, I'm not going to grade, and so those are informal assessments. However, you can have formal assessments that may be formative. For example, a quiz, or also I'm thinking of a homework assignment, and you might want to grade it, but you might also want to use the feedback you get from that assignment to see how well students are doing. So it can also be formative. So formal assessments may be formative, or they may be summative. So for example, if they come at the end of a unit and you're not going to go back and reteach, and it's just for the purpose of a grade, then it would be summative. One thing to be aware of is that you're constantly using formative assessment in the classroom. Sometimes we call it instructional assessment, so if you hear that term, you should think formative assessment. So for example, in this course, I use a lot of different ways to assess your understanding. I give quizzes from time to time. I use discussion board postings where I can gauge the level of your understanding based on your response to a question. I use projects and assignments with graded rubrics. So some of that is formative. So for example, the discussion board postings, even though they're formal because I grade them, I'm using them a lot of times as a formative assessment, clearing up misconceptions. Discussion board postings are a way to do that. Now, how do you do formative assessment in the classroom? I'm going to give you a few examples, but there are many, many different tools that you can use for formative assessments. And indeed, one of your assignments is to go out and research and find a couple of those tools that you might want to use and post about it in this week's discussion board. Observations can be a powerful formative assessment tool. So your textbook talks about looking at students' verbal and non-verbal cues. So for example, if you see that students are yawning or they're leaning back in their desk, that's a behavioral cue that says that they are bored or they don't understand what they're learning, and so they're tuning out. When you do observations, one way to formally assess is to ask the class to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down if they understand or they don't understand. Some teachers hand out red, yellow, green cards. Green means yes, I understand the concept. Yellow means I'm sort of getting it, but I'm not quite there. And red means stop, I need you to help me with some understanding. When I used to teach and I had seat work, I gave each student a cup, a plastic cup, and I would say to the student, face up or turn it up, right way. If you understand it, turn it over. If you don't understand it, and I will come and circulate and help you if I saw a cup turned upside down. Questioning is also a great way to formatively assess in the classroom, and your book does a great job in talking about the different kinds of questioning, so I won't beat these points, but again, some things to think about when you're thinking ahead and planning for how you're going to question the class. Your question should be clear and succinct. Again, use blooms to match the questions to the learning targets. So generally, lower level knowledge and comprehensive questions start with what and who. You might, if you're doing more complex thinking, use questions like why. You might use the prompts like judge or evaluate. Involve the entire class, but I also will say it's good to have a systematic calling technique. So what research has found is that teachers tend to call on boys more frequently than girls. So you might randomize, call on a boy, then a girl, then a boy, then a girl. You can use powerful new learning technologies like eye clickers to have students show whole class responses. Allow wait time, and this can be really, really awkward, but the research shows you need to give a few seconds of wait time and to allow students to process and think. And you can tell students ahead of time, I'm going to allow you to have some think time before I call for a question. For an answer. So you might ask the question and go 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi in your head, not out loud. And when you get to 5 Mississippi, then say, who has a response? Give good responses, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, specifically next week when we talk about feedback. Avoid yes/no questions. So instead of saying, who did Christopher Columbus discover America? You could put it in terms of who could tell me something about Christopher Columbus's exploration to the Americas. Use probes to extend answers and appropriate sequencing material to help students get to a higher level of critical thinking. So what this means is start at the lower level of Bloom's taxonomy. Establish the facts first. Use those what, when, how questions. And then gradually go up Bloom's taxonomy until you're asking more complex and critical thinking types of questions like why. Written probes are a great way to informally or formatively assess learning. Exit slips, this really works very well either for elementary, middle, or high school students, and that's simply, let's say you're teaching a middle school science lesson and you want to assess what students remember about a lesson, and give them 5 minutes at the end of class and say, write down 3 things that you learned that are new today, and have them hand it to you on the way out. That's why it's called an exit slip. Exit slips are also great ways to pre-assess. So when you're planning a unit, you'll know what students understand. So if I haven't taught the unit on manatees yet, I can say, write down everything you know about manatees and use that for pre-assessment. Individual whiteboards, some schools use, and ask students to write the answers to a question and hold them up for teachers to visually assess. KWLs, most of you pre-K teachers or early elementary teachers know these things. It's simply a 3-column chart, what I know, what I want to know, what I learned. These are excellent pre- and post-assessment devices. Graphic organizers or concept maps allow students to express what they know. So let's say, for example, I'm halfway through teaching a unit on space, and I want to have the students do a concept map. I could put 10 vocabulary words on the board, such as planet, star, asteroid, all the space items, and ask students to create a concept map, putting each word in a circle and linking it with arrows, and putting words on the arrow to show the relationship. Lists or summaries. Make a list of everything you know about this topic. And finally, learning logs are really powerful devices. They work very well in each subject. The way a learning log worked is you give each student a notebook, and let's say you're doing math problems, and the student could do the math problems in the notebook, hand it in for grading, you score the problems, and then you give feedback under teacher feedback. You could say, Billy, um, you you didn't carry your 10 on this one. Billy, the next day you hand Billy the notebook. He reads your feedback. He writes any questions he has, or that he understands your feedback. So it's a way to dialogue with students and provide them specific feedback. You can't really do this effectively as effectively in class because there's so many competing things that are competing for your attention. But learning logs shared with the teacher are great tools. Activities can even be types of formative assessments. So for example, cup color, we discussed a little bit, red, yellow, green cups. Four corners, this is getting little students up and having them move, and even sometimes big students. So for example, if you explained a concept to a class, you can say, okay, if you don't understand, go over in that corner. If you sort of understand, go over in that corner. If you totally get it, come over this corner. And you can even have pre-done follow-ups for each of those groups. So you could have a reteaching activity for the group that doesn't get it. You could have an enrichment activity for the group that does get it. And you could go over and easily answer the questions for the ones that are almost there. Games are awesome formative assessment activities. So many of us grew up playing spelling bee games, for example, and other types of competitive and non-competitive classroom games. Think, pair, share. Many times students will be hesitant to share an answer with the whole class because they're embarrassed about sharing their thoughts, but they'll share with another individual. So you could say, turn and talk to a partner and say what the answer to this question is, and then you could circulate through the room, listening to which students are getting it and which students are not. Again, all of these assessments are formative and they're not graded, so they are informal. Finally, conferencing, meeting with individual students. Most people think of this as a way to tell students what you think, but conferencing is also a valuable way to get information about what a student understands. It's an informal process again, but very, very powerful. There are some formal formative assessments that, as we've talked about, formative assessments can be formal, and this is when they're graded. So pre-instructional exercises, I wouldn't suggest grading this on content, but you might be able to grade it on just completion. Written homework, we're going to be doing our formative assessment assignment for the class based on some math written homework that you'll grade. In-class assignments, quizzes, and classroom response systems. I want to talk for a little bit now about your formative assessment assignment, which is due October 16th. It's worth 15% of your course grade, and I've uploaded the instructions and all the resources that you needed to use in this week's folder as well as in your assignments folder on the course homepage. This week, we're going to focus on part 1 of the formative assessment. And so what you'll need to do is go into the folder Formative Assessment Assignment, which is in, again, this week's learning module, and open and read the file Formative Assessment Instructions. You're probably going to want to save that file because you're going to need to refer to it over multiple weeks. Then you're going to open a file called Recording Your Work. Now what you're going to do is read the instructions, and as you go through the instructions, you're going to record your work in the Recording Your Work file. This is the file you will upload completed at the end. This week, I'd like you to read the instructions and do part 1. There's some resources that you're going to be using, including a student homework assignment. This is a math homework assignment that was actually given 4th grade level. And all of the instructions are included in the instruction file. You'll have to do things like align the questions with Common Core standards, come up with learning objectives, score the assignment. It's going to be helpful if you do the problems yourself. Some of you may be a little math phobic. Remember, this is only 4th grade math, but if you do need assistance, I'd encourage you to find someone who is good at math in your life and ask them to help you out here. And if everything else fails, you know, there are many different Khan videos, and Googling helps as well. But again, this is 4th grade Common Core math. So you don't have to complete the entire assignment this week. You're going to complete part one, save your file, and then next week you'll work on part 2, which is, so part 1 is more about just understanding the data coming out of the grading assignment. Part 2 will then be using the data to inform instruction. So the entire assignment is due on October 16th.